We started out talking about leadership. Leaders are limited only by their inability to see and deal with their past traumas, I believe. So that becomes their primary limitation.
A lot of times, too, our best survival strategies in childhood, which were wildly adaptive and intelligent, are the very things that are harming us and constraining our leadership as adults. How do we take this pain inside of us and truly convert it into power? When you understand your triggers, you are unstoppable. And the other thing I say to people too is like, if it's a trigger, it's never a surprise.
Right.
And this is another big twist, I think, for your listeners.
Dr. DiGangi, so stoked to have you here today. Appreciate you being on the show.
Thanks for having me, Mark. I'm excited to be here as well.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I'm really excited to learn about neuropsychology. Like, to me, I would assume that anything to do with psychology had to do with neurology, but I assume by neuropsychology, you're looking at the physiological aspect of psychological functioning. And what does that mean, neuropsychology?
Yeah, so I am a neuropsychologist, which means I'm a clinical psychologist with specialized expertise in the brain. And, psychologists are obviously incredibly interested in emotion and behavior. I have a lot of neuroscience training. I've conducted a lot of neuroscience research. And my expertise really sits in the intersection of the brain, emotion, and leadership.
Okay.
And you really can't talk about leadership. I think a perfect synonym for leadership is actually relationship.
Right.
So I really study the brain's effect on our emotion and our relationships.
Terrific. I'm excited to talk about that a little bit further. How did you get interested in this? Give us a little bit about your background, your origin story, please.
Okay, I don't often get asked about that. So sort of a really windy road. So my father is actually, I come from a lineage of psychologists. So my father is actually a psychologist. I never thought that I was going to be a psychologist. Oddly enough, of all places on the planet, I begun my career at the White House. So I worked at the White House. I worked in the press office. I did several U.S. presidential campaigns.
But you didn't just land there. So what was the run up? Give us a little bit of the backstory, like how you ended up at the White House.
I kind of did just land. So basically I was a journalism major. So I mentioned, my father was a psychologist. My brother is disabled. My mother was a teacher of immigrants. So there was always a lot of emphasis in my household about people's stories, about social justice. I like to write. That's why I wrote Energy Rising. And I'm a very good listener. So I thought I would become a journalist. I went to the University of Iowa for my undergraduate. And I had an internship. I actually just told this story the other day to a friend of mine. I got an internship, a daily paper in Iowa. And I was really excited about it. It was a great daily. And I had a mentor who really kind of helped me. I threw out an application to the White House, just thinking that I would never hear back. And actually, I did hear back, and they said, we'd love to have you come intern here. I really respected my mentor, and I went to her, and I was like, oh my God, I just got this position at the White House. And she was like, well, unfortunately, you're going to have to turn it down because you already gave your commitment to this daily newspaper. And I really respected her, and so I was like, I guess I'm not going. So I actually called the paper and explained the situation. And they were like, oh, no, you should definitely turn us down, go to the White House.
Totally.
So what happened at the White House was incredible. I still don't know why this happened, but I was in the press office. And when I was there, the person who headed up the radio show at the White House left to go take a job on the Hill. Mm-hmm. And they were like, hey, you're going to fill in until we get a new person. So I was riding in motorcades. I was at all the press conferences in the Rose Garden. I drafted the president's 4th of July radio address. It was wild.
What president was in office then?
Clinton.
Okay. What a great experience.
It was. To start your career there
around
leadership, it was astounding.
I bet. That's amazing. So that was all before your PhD? Before you became a psychologist? Okay.
Yeah, correct. So what happened was, I worked on, like I said, some presidential campaigns. I worked for a very noteworthy political consultant. And I'm sure some people can relate to this. I got tired of the politics of politics, but I was very interested in how policy and activism could serve people. So I started doing a lot of international humanitarian aid, a lot of international development work. And it took me all over the world. So I had worked now in Detroit and Chicago, all over the US. I'd worked in Latin America, Nigeria, South Africa, a tiny country called Lesotho. And what was really striking to me, Mark, is that everywhere I went, things were wildly diverse, but hope always felt like hope. Rage always felt like rage. Fear always felt like fear. Betrayal always felt like betrayal. And I started to say, isn't it? Because I was working in a lot of trauma zones. I was working in a UN declared disaster zone in South Africa. And I started to say, wherever I went on the planet, trauma seemed to look very similar. And so I became very interested in sort of the effects on the nervous system. And that's when I ultimately decided to get a PhD, and I became a neuropsychologist. I've conducted research all over. So Georgetown, Harvard, Columbia, and really became deeply, deeply interested in how the brain really constructs our lives.
I love that you got out into the world and had such diverse and like intimate experiences in troubled areas of the world because not many people really have that experience, that wherever you go, human beings are human first. And they may look different, they may speak different, they may have different beliefs and ideas, but like you said, underneath it all, we all deal with the same fears, the same anxieties, the same stresses, and learning how to deal with that and learning how to find or to see that commonality is profound for all leaders. I think that I wish other people could, or everybody could, get out more and to experience other cultures and a nitty-gritty level like that. So that's cool. I can see how that really would shape your interest in neuropsychology. Hi, Mark Devine here from SealFit. After 2 years of development, I'm super stoked to announce the launch of SealFit supplements and our first product, SealFit Electro Greens. This is the highest quality organic greens you can find, combined with electrolytes into one powerful supplement. Take with 8 ounces of water in the morning or add to your smoothie to get your day kicked off right with the proper nutritional supplementation and hydration support. And you can also use it as a pick-me-up booster during the day or after a workout. It dissolves immediately, and believe it or not, it tastes great. I've had many testimonials already saying it's the best tasting greens that they have ever tried. So hoo-yah, SealFitSupplements.com, or you can find it on Amazon by searching for SealFit Electro Greens. Hoo-yah. Let's do this. Divine out. That is delicious. So what was the path from NGO work? You just decided to go to get your doctorate?
I was working again in all of these trauma zones. And again, remember, like my family of origin, my father was doing a lot of trauma and addiction work. I think like a lot of our families, I came from a family with a lot of trauma and addiction work. So, and I think like a lot of our families, they're very complex, but they're also very wonderful. And so I always kind of had an eye on human suffering. And I worked for international labor. So I did a lot of post-conflict reconstruction projects. So really working with, war, famine, orphans, like deep, deep trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And there were some wonderful, wonderful programs, like rebuilding civil society programs, educational programs, physical health programs. But I was like, who is tending to the emotional needs of people? And, the funders, like whether it's the UN or the US government or the European countries, are very intelligent, right? So they're saying like, listen, like we know there's a lot of emotional trauma here, but what is the science? Like, we're not just going to throw money at something. So how do we actually fix this? And so I have a pretty analytical brain. I have sort of a knack for science. And I said, I'm going to go empirically study this question. Like, what does it actually take when we are in profound pain? And again, in our countries, on social media, in our families, in our jobs, what does it take when we're in pain to transform that pain into power?
Right.
And that really is the premise of Energy Rising, and it was wild to me. So I've been approached, I would say, with some relative frequent cadence to kind of do public facing things, like be an expert on a Netflix show or do a documentary. And I always said no. I like to say I'm a Midwest academic who likes to go to 2 good parties a year. And then the rest of the time I like to be left alone in my office, right?
Yeah, I'm with you on that, by the way.
So Harvard Business Review approached me and said, would you write a book on basically the neuroscience of leadership and the neuroscience of emotion? And I said, to have this opportunity, because obviously HBR has an enormous footprint. They have so much credibility in terms of leadership. To have this opportunity to talk to human beings about human pain and human power, it was one of the greatest opportunities in my life. It was such a meaning, and I hope all authors feel this way about their book, but it was such a transformative experience for me. And I get messages now every day from people all over the world who I think are really being changed by the book, because Energy Rising is basically a blueprint for how to take our pain, whether it's stress, frustration, irritation, all the way up to rage and trauma, and transform it into something meaningful.
That's awesome. Yeah, I've written 6 books now, and each one of them is quite the transformative experience, right? They really do come through us, and
They do.
and they change us, right? And for authors like us, I don't want to speak for everyone, but my experience certainly was each one has been transformative, and you change a little bit because the process of writing clarifies thinking, and you get downloads, and there's insights that you never really understood when you started writing that comes out.
I got chills when you said that. I completely understand what you're saying. And I am a scientist. I'm very well published in the academic literature, but to kind of cross over and write a quote popular press book, you're exactly right. Like that, taking the hard science, because I think there was a lot of integrity in writing this book, and like taking the hard science and converting it over into a way that isn't academic. You really have to have control of that message.
Yeah. Oh, that's terrific. I can't wait to learn more. Before we kind of dig into that, can you define for us a few things, like from your perspective, what is trauma? And even what's an emotion? What is emotional energy and what is trauma? Let's
Oh
start
my
there.
God, we're gonna spend we could have 5 podcasts just on this. Okay,
That's okay.
how do I want to start this? Let me sort of back up and say what's a really useful and practical way to think about the brain. Okay.
Right.
So I think that, depending on my mood, it either tickles me or kind of pisses me off, like that people pay more attention to the intelligent operation of their cell phones or now chat GPT
True that.
than they pay to the intelligent maneuvering of the most exquisite machinery of our own, which is their own brain and their own nervous system. So one of the things I think I do well in my career, and I think Energy Rising did really well, was it's a practical guide about how to use our brains. Well, the first question is, what is the brain? And the brain is most fundamentally, I think most practically to think about it, it is a pattern detection machine. Okay. So your brain is moving you through your life largely unconsciously, going apple, 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 fill in the blank. And I hope our conversation will evolve to talk about uncertainty, because I have a lot of things to say about uncertainty. So this fill in the blank moment is just the future. A synonym for the future is uncertainty. A synonym for uncertainty is ambiguity. In other words, it's just unknown. So your brain's going apple, 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 and then it will predict what the next thing will be. Well, it's going to predict it's going to be an apple. Does it have to be an apple? No, it could have been a banana, it could have been a pencil, but it's going to predict it's an apple. Now, overwhelmingly, this is very adaptive. We've all had the experience where we're listening to a podcast like yours driving home, or we're on the phone and we end up in our driveway. And we have no idea how we ended up in our driveway, but there we are.
Because the brain filled in the blank while you were doing something else. Yeah.
So what the brain is neurophysiologically doing is it's taking past data encoded as memories and superimposing it into future situations.
That's right.
Okay. So you started asking me what is trauma. And I've been asked a lot, what is emotion? But most people don't ask me what is trauma. I'm going to give you what I think is the best definition for trauma.
Good.
Trauma is, so if the brain is a pattern detector, trauma is the violent shattering of the pattern.
Wow.
So for example, if I go to my mailbox at night and I get assaulted on the way to my mailbox, the real trauma is I've gone to my mailbox a million times. This isn't supposed to happen here. So there's a lot of people talking about trauma. I've watched the mental health conversation now for 40 years, okay? And it's been incredible to watch it evolve. I think it's such a richer conversation now. But the piece a lot of people still miss when they talk about trauma is a core component of trauma must be confusion.
Right. Lack of control.
Yeah. If it makes sense, then it can't be trauma.
Interesting. What about, and this isn't like a gotcha thing, but you mentioned kind of your upbringing. A lot of people grow up in, households that are less than nurturing. Let's just be polite, right? For mine, a lot of anger, a lot of abuse, a lot of alcohol being sloshed around. And so the little child with an undifferentiated mind doesn't have a pattern besides that. And isn't that also trauma? The violence isn't interrupting a pattern. It is the pattern. And I believe that's also trauma.
You're entirely right. So one of the things about being any scientist, including a trauma scientist, is operationally defining what we're talking about.
That's right. Yeah.
So one of the things we struggle with a lot in trauma research is trauma is not a monolith.
Right.
So here's just a few of the questions we sit with. Okay. Who did the trauma happen to? Who perpetrated the trauma? How many times was the trauma happened? At what stage of development did it happen? When you told your caretakers about your trauma, did they take swift action? Were your caretakers the very perpetrator? Yes?
Yeah, it's complex. In fact, trauma, like the trauma work that I do with veterans, we talk about that complex trauma because what we've noticed in the Courage Foundation, which is our foundation, is that a lot of times, if not most of the time, the trauma from war is the lesser of the traumas. Or said another way, it magnifies the underlying childhood trauma.
So I've done a lot of work with combat veterans.
Have you?
Yeah, so I've done a lot of trauma treatment. So a lot of, you might be from prolonged exposure,
Yes.
cognitive processing. So the three most evidence-based treatments are PE, prolonged exposure, CPT. A lot of people have heard of CBT. CPT is cognitive processing therapy, and then EMDR. So when we treat trauma, we treat it clinically, and you might think that this is interesting, and I think you already know it on some level, and maybe you even know it explicitly. So when we both treat trauma and we study trauma empirically, we ask people for all their traumas, okay? And we say, like, and to your point, let's just use a combat veteran as an example, but this applies across the board. There could be combat trauma, but then there's almost always, and when I say almost always, I mean almost always, many, many more traumas. And so we ask people, and this is a really important point for your listeners, what is what we call the worst, we call it the index trauma or the worst traumatic event.
Right.
And if we do trauma treatment on something that's less than the worst traumatic event, we do not meaningfully expect, for example, the PTSD symptoms to attenuate. Because what's happening is your brain is saying, okay, we can deal with this trauma because it's not so bad.
It's a little safer. Yeah.
Yes, but there's no way I'm actually going to process this other trauma.
Since a lot of those, like master trauma, we'll just call it, or the main thing trauma, happened often at a young age, and the memories of them are suppressed or repressed. And so the individual can't actually access it. How do we get them to access it so that we can work on that main thing?
You're making a really great point. So I want to just say something about energy rising. So energy rising is, I wrote it in what I call 8 neuroenergetic codes. So each code is a blueprint for how to work with your nervous system. And again, the premise is, how do we take this pain inside of us and truly convert it into power? And by the way, when I talk about emotions as an energy, I'm not talking about this metaphorically. I'm not talking about it metaphysically. I am talking about this neurophysiologically. Emotions are quite literally neuroelectrical impulses. They are neuroelectrical energy. This is the only reason I can do my fMRI and EEG research, is because I'm detecting neuroelectrochemical signals, okay? So, I think a big part of the idea here is, so the 5th code or the 5th blueprint is basically what happened to us in childhood. And in childhood, I'm just going to give you one statistic, but what happens to brain development in childhood is astounding. In years 0 through 3, more than 1 million neural connections are made every single second.
That's extraordinary. I thought you were going to say every day, every second.
Every second. We now have information that shows, research that shows that learning begins in utero.
Of course. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Why wouldn't it, right? Why wouldn't it? As soon as the brain is largely formed. Yeah.
But to your point here is, and I want to go back to this idea of both trauma and the brain being a pattern detection machine. And I would love to hear your thoughts on this. When we talk about the pain of trauma, the sort of the scourge of trauma is not so much about what it did to us.
Right. It's our response to it.
It's about what it does to us.
Right. That's right.
So this idea that, like, I wasn't safe then, I'm never safe again. Mm-hmm. I couldn't trust you then, I can never trust anyone ever again.
Right.
People in power abuse me. People in power will always abuse me.
Right.
So you see, it's the trauma that lives in in the nervous system. The reason I actually called energy rising, and I thought a lot about the title. I thought more about the naming of, I got 2 little kids, and I thought more about the naming of energy rising than I did my own kids, is the human physiology knows what to do with waste. Okay, so we eat food, we pass it. We take in oxygen, we let go of carbon dioxide. Like every 27 days, our skin cells go away. But there's something singular about emotions, about painful emotions, that when we have painful emotions that are in our nervous system, instead of just letting the energy rise, and by letting the energy rise, I mean just simply feeling the emotion and letting it pass.
Mm-hmm.
What most people do, because the experience is so aversive, it is painful to feel our negative feelings, they keep it inside and they shove it down and they shove it down and they shove it down and they shove it down. And then you have a lifetime of a clogged emotional pipe, a clogged nervous system.
Right. I love how you talk about that.
And so what happens is somebody cuts me off at a stop sign on Monday, and I'm pissed off about it sideways until next Tuesday. You see? Because the energy can't really flow in an intelligent way. And so trauma processing and the work that we do on people's nervous systems, I mean, not all of us have intense trauma that requires trauma processing, but I think the single greatest thing that, and I hope to talk to you about this, is to stop avoiding our painful feelings.
Yeah, I mean, you have to face it head on. That was my whole last book, Staring Down the Wolf, is about that. Facing your fear and dealing with the trauma triggers and the responses, because that's where the treasures of leadership are found there. Because, we started out talking about leadership. Leaders are limited only by their inability to see and deal with their past traumas, I believe. So that becomes their primary limitation. And so they end up overcoming that with perfectionism or righteousness or needing to be in charge, or, however they show up is going to be based upon whatever structures were put in place to protect themselves from traumas of an earlier life.
I think that you're so on point here. I always say understanding the brain helps people really understand where leadership breaks down. And anyone can lead on the days when it's easy.
Yeah, we used to say everyone could be a frogman on a sunny day.
Yeah.
As a Navy SEAL.
I think it's worth making this point here, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like right now the world is having a moment where a lot of people are talking about, pick it, authenticity, transparency, inclusion, empathy. Well, on the days when everybody's listening to me, I'm happy to include you.
Mm-hmm.
On the days
and
when
agreeing with me.
Yeah. On the days when I have no fear that you're going to take this information and use it in any way to harm me, I'm happy to be transparent with you.
Right.
When do these big lofty ideas of collaboration and connection and transparency and inclusion and belonging break down? They always and only break down in the fire of bad feelings. It only breaks down on the days when I'm afraid. It only breaks down on the days when I feel rejected. It only breaks down on the days when I feel overwhelmed. So I completely agree with you. If we want to strengthen our leadership, it is always and only forged in the fire of these fierce emotions.
100%. We do a lot of breath work and a lot of, things to get out of fight or flight, right? To get back into homeostatic balance. And that's a really a necessary step, right? In the SEALs, we would say pause, breathe, think about it, and then act, right? Instead of just immediately reacting. But you mentioned different responses beyond just fight or flight or, kind of rest and recover. So what are those 5 different stances or responses?
Oh, in terms of like when we get triggered.
Yeah, when you get triggered.
Because I think too, like when you understand your triggers, you are unstoppable. And the other thing I say to people too is like, if it's a trigger, it's never a surprise.
Right, because it's happened before many, many times.
By virtue of it being a trigger, I sometimes make a joke that nobody ever comes to see me because they got hit in the face with a 2x4. Like the first time I get hit in the face with a 2x4,
the wrong doctor.
That's horrible. Let's never do that again. The brain in some ways does not distinguish between emotional pain and physical pain. It's like some of the same structures are involved in pain processing. But the difference between physical pain and emotional pain, a lot of times, is that if I burn my hand on a hot stove, I'll never do that again. In other words, my brain will encode itself to like never put my hand on that hot stove again. In neuropsychology, we call it one trial learning. But if you think about most of the pain in your life, your frustration with your coworkers, your anger at home, your disappointment with people on social media, they are all necessarily chronic. Nobody ever comes to talk to me about the one time they got in a fight with their spouse in 1987, right? So it's like there's this chronicity to our emotional pain. And so I think when we understand, like, we do ourselves a big service when we stop pretending like we're surprised by our triggers. So our body responds in one of 5 ways. The first is fight, right? We get aggressive, we get combative. We've all understand it. We've probably all been there. The second is to run, to flee, right? And this is a lot avoidance. A big one that people are now talking about these days is freeze. So you asked me to do something and I just kind of like, I don't really have an answer.
A lot of people froze during COVID.
Yeah.
They didn't know what to do. That's the ultimate uncertainty, is people just stand in place. And then that was exacerbated with everything else, lockdowns and everything.
Yeah. It is. I think the brain is the most extraordinary machine on the entire planet.
Hey, maybe you like a pair of good jeans like I do. I love a good pair of jeans, especially when they're warm out and they fit like a glove. But it's tough to find them, and they're super uncomfortable until they do. And oftentimes, by the time they fit like a glove, they don't look so great. That's why I'm super stoked to find Duer, D-U-E-R jeans, and to have them as a sponsor for the Mark Divine Show. Duer jeans are incredible. They fit extremely well. They're extremely comfortable as well, right out of the box. And you can wear them for almost any occasions. They dress up or down. I use them to go out for dinner, and I also train in them. They're that comfortable. These are made for everyday living, all sorts of things you can do with these jeans. They're not your typical jeans. Their denim features 360-degree stretch, made from technical fibers that keep you cool and dry, and they're sustainably made with, believe it or not, plant-based materials. So check them out at their flagship store, either in LA or Denver, or shopduer.com, and use my URL, shopduer.com/divine, D-I-V-I-N-E, to get 20% off your first order. Again, shopduer, that's shopduer.com/divine. Go there, check it out, get 20% off your first order. You're going to love these jeans. They're the most desired jeans now in the country. I love them, and I know you'll too.
And so I think a lot of times we have shame about, like, we're frustrated by ourselves, or we have shame, like, why did I freeze? Or why was I languishing? Or why? But if you really think about what freeze is, it's an incredibly adaptive state in the face of acute trauma. If there's predation involved, if I'm a prey and a predator is coming after me, and I freeze perfectly because the fear and the danger is so acute, that might save my life. So when we're in situations where we feel like the danger is so incredibly high, we'll basically freeze and leave our bodies. And to put this into the human world, a classic example, and this is a very extreme example, but I want people to see it, is you'll have, another term for freeze can sometimes be dissociation. So if I'm being physically abused, I'm being sexually or physically abused, it's very adaptive for me to leave my body.
That's necessary for survival. Exactly.
Absolutely. So again, like, the brain is really trying to protect us. We just have to understand how to intelligently engage with the machinery.
What are the other 2 responses?
The fourth one is fawn.
Oh, yes, I've heard this.
Mm-hmm. So fawn is when we feel a lot of it. We got this coding, we got this blueprint, and you think about your brain like a computer. We were all coded in our childhoods. We got this coding from our parents that we could not speak truth to power. We had to kind of, be on our best behavior, make sure mommy and daddy were okay.
Take care of the perpetrator.
Exactly.
You see this a lot in prisoner war situations, right?
Say more about that.
Through torture, the fawning process, right, is unlocked, where the tortured then starts to codependently take care of the torturer, like Stockholm syndrome and whatnot.
Exactly. So, and again, super adaptive. And a lot of times, too, our best survival strategies in childhood, which were wildly adaptive and intelligent, are the very things that are harming us and constraining our leadership as adults. And then the fifth one is what I call fall apart. So this is somebody who, you mentioned perfectionism early. Like, they get one thing wrong and the whole thing is ruined. one person doesn't agree and the project is over. One person signals their dissent and they can no longer have a relation. In other words, their ability, their sort of ego structures ability, and I mean ego more in a Freudian sense, like my ability to like hold my identity is so fragile that any kind of minor infraction is actually a catastrophe.
Right. It sounds a lot like fleeing, but your fleeing is actually removing yourself. This is just blowing it up.
Yeah, and you can see they all obviously
They
have
overlap, yeah.
Venn diagrams. They were going to overlap.
Right. That's fascinating. So now with that, thank you for that. That's awesome. In your book, Energy Rising, when someone is triggered, like and they're about ready to head into danger zone, how do we, like, what's the first step? How do we get out of that? I mentioned pause and breathe, like teaching people just to stop everything and to watch, just not engage with that reaction that's arising. But that takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of
Yeah. So, I get asked this question all the time. When the toddler is in the middle of a meltdown, what can you do to help the toddler? The answer is you let the meltdown pass,
Yeah,
right?
let the meltdown
And
pass.
in fact, the more you engage, do you have kids?
I do, yeah.
You would probably remember the more you try to soothe them or maybe this or let me explain, it just exacerbates the whole thing. So if we're serious about changing our relationship with our lives, our emotional power, our nervous systems, we got to think more upstream because by the time I'm really triggered, my frontal lobe is offline. And what's really controlling my behavior now is this limbic system. So the work really is like, again, we were kind of laughing about it earlier, but like, what are my triggers? Now, I want to say something here because what happens is people will say, and this is such a powerful shift for people, they'll start to list their triggers. They'll say, this thing that's due next week, this person, that person, the thing that they said, the thing they're going to say. So they kind of go situation by situation by situation by situation.
Mm-hmm.
There is almost no power in our situations.
Right.
Okay. So I said the brain is a pattern detector. And the example I gave earlier is that the brain is going apple, 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 except the brain is not actually moving you through your life going apple, apple, apple. Your brain is actually moving you through your life based on these emotional codes or these emotional patterns. So I say to people, I hope you have a good emotional code, but most people come to me to take their painful parts and convert them into more powerful, resilient parts. So I say, what is your core emotional code that's causing you pain? I'll give you a few examples. I'm sure you'll recognize some of them. Things never work out for me. Things never work out for me. Things never work out for me. Or nobody listens to me. Nobody listens to me. Nobody listens to me. Or I'm no good. I'm no good. I'm no good. And so then I get into a situation at Starbucks where somebody gets my order wrong and I'm pissed off about it. I'm not just like annoyed for 2 seconds. I'm like mad. Why? Because what's happening here unconsciously is the activation of this unconscious emotional pattern that nobody listens to me. And if people really took me seriously, they would understand that I wanted skim milk, and this whole thing starts.
Right.
Okay. One of the pieces here, and it's going to sound wildly big, but it is so true. The whole of human consciousness rises on the energy of emotion.
100%. I agree with that. Yeah, because it's all based upon memory. Memory is forged in the crucible of trauma because we tend to not so much remember the good things. We remember the bad things. And it's not the thing that we remember that's remembered. It's the story around it. Like you said, it's the future story. And so you might have a few, but I love that you boil it down to everyone's got generally like one core kind of
one core code,
background code that is always running, very rarely verbalized, right?
Very rarely.
But it's there. And that's going to color, like energy, you said, emotion is energy. So that energy is going to color your world.
And a lot of people think, very understandable, it seems kind of intuitive. If I had one word to describe all my work, it would be either counterintuitive or opposite. People think that the situation is what is going to cause the emotion.
Yeah, no, right. Everything's a projection, right? It's the emotion that causes how you perceive the situation.
And just to give you a couple of empirical examples about this is a great example. So I've done a lot of work on, I think I mentioned PTSD and trauma, a lot of stuff in the academic literature. And what we understand, everyone has heard of post-traumatic stress disorder, but the analog to post-traumatic stress disorder is something called post-traumatic growth. And we study this concept empirically as well. So two people can be exposed to very similar traumas, combat, childhood abuse, childhood sexual abuse, and people have very different responses. Well, why? Right? So we used to think that the event, the trauma itself was predictive. The trauma itself explains less than 10% of the variance in terms of post-traumatic functioning.
Mm-hmm.
That's amazing what I just said.
That is amazing.
Right? It's like, okay, so when we have pain in our lives, it's so easy. And I'm sure you've worked with people. I have certainly worked with people who have endured so much trauma that if they said, I'm never getting up again, no one would even blame them.
For sure. For sure. And yet they have a choice. And oftentimes those individuals who have suffered the most end up breaking through and thriving the most, which is interesting.
I think that they become this evidence-based, this standard for human resilience. I could sob talking to you about it. I mean, I'm thinking of a very specific. I do coaching with leaders. I do a lot of work with leaders, but I also have a clinical practice and treat patients. I'm thinking of one of my patients right now. Like, it's the trauma work is very heavy, but it's also gorgeous and wildly inspiring because you see the power of the human spirit and just
That's extraordinary. Yeah.
it really is.
Tell us about, I know we only have a few minutes left here, but you mentioned 8 different codes. I think it'd be fascinating for the listeners to just get a sense for what those are, as pointers to, work to be done or things to look out for.
Yeah, let me, maybe I'll pick like a couple to kind of give a little bit of. So one of the codes I wrote about was uncertainty.
Right.
Okay. And the reason I had to write about uncertainty is the human brain is effectively allergic to uncertainty. So there's tons of uncertainty in our lives, in our businesses, in the world, with AI, with social media. So what is the most powerful way that we can respond to uncertainty? So maybe should I give a little bit of information about this?
Yeah, please do. Yeah, I have my thoughts on it, but I want to hear yours, obviously. That's great.
I'd love to. Do you want to start? Like, what do you think about it?
Well, you're right. I believe that trauma is induced when people feel out of control. And so as a child, of course, you're going to be out of control much of the time. So if you're not feeling safe, then this feeling of out of control. And so being out of control equals uncertainty. When faced with uncertain, you're going to look for either patterns, to use your term, or you're going to move to some other territory where you feel there's going to be more certainty, or you'll be able to regain some control. And almost always that's back into some pattern that served you in the past.
Isn't that the truth?
Yep. And it's not going to serve you in the future, right?
But I think too, to just really have reverence for how hard the work is. There's all these statistics, like before February, like 90% of New Year's resolutions fail. Right? Companies spend millions and millions and millions of dollars to produce change, and overwhelmingly like 85% of them fail. It's like, is that because people didn't want the change? No, I think people mean exactly what they say a lot of times. I think what happens is the emotional resistance, the work of change, it is really hard. But when we do it intelligently, it does become a lot easier.
How do we face uncertainty in your model?
So again, I'm going to go back to this idea is like, okay, the brain's allergic to uncertainty. And why? Because actually, this is an important point I want to make. The human brain really can tolerate any emotional experience except one. There's really only one emotional state or one affective state that the human brain cannot tolerate. And that state is confusion.
Because it's a meaning-making machine. And so if it can't make meaning, right, that's like the worst thing ever, right? It's death.
It is. So if you kind of go like back to like apple, fill in the blank. Well, is it so just like the lungs are going to breathe, just like a cell phone is going to take phone calls, the brain is going to do what the machinery of the brain is designed to do. And I've said already in our conversation, the machinery of the brain is designed to predict. So in the absence of information, the brain is going to predict. And what is it going to predict? It's not going to predict apple. It's going to predict a coded old emotional pattern.
So apple, 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 I'm not worthy. Apple, 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 nobody listens to me. Nobody loves me. Right. That's
Haven't you
fascinating.
ever had like a totally ridiculous experience that you can totally laugh at yourself later? Like your spouse or your friend didn't text you back in a time frame you thought was reasonable, and then you're like, are they mad at me or they're being rude to me? It's like we come up with all these projections, right? Well, why is the brain doing that? Well, the brain is doing that obviously to keep you safe. The brain's number one function is survival. So if I predict something that I need to defend against, something potentially dangerous, I'm going to be more vigilant and I'm going to be more ready to tackle danger. Fine. It's fine. There's no problem there. The issue, though, is, and this is another big twist, I think, for your listeners. So I keep talking about trauma and PTSD. My area of expertise, most academically, is the brain and anxiety, right? So PTSD is an anxiety disorder, and obviously, anxiety exists on a continuum. The best definition that I can give people for anxiety is a disturbed relationship with certainty.
Say that again and say more, please.
The best definition I can give you for anxiety is a disturbed relationship with certainty.
Nice. Interesting. Okay.
So,
Yeah.
what happens is I feel uncertain, like we all do, because the future is just uncertain. And so I very naturally, unconsciously try to create certainty. But what happens overwhelmingly to most of us is we start to create external forms of certainty. In Energy Rising, I write about these and I call them the overs. You'll probably recognize some of them. I start to overwork. I start to overthink. I start to overdeliver. I start to overgive. I start to overaccommodate. I start to overengineer, and on and on and on. So, what the brain is actually doing is, because this emotional energy of uncertainty is arousing my nervous system, it's producing a behavioral response for me to try to overcompensate in my environment to create certainty. The problem with this is working is amazing. I think a lot of us love our jobs. Overworking is always and only done because of fear. Giving is amazing. Overgiving, we do because we're afraid of whatever, being rejected come up with the story, right? So if you think about, I'm going to use a really extreme example because if it's true at the extreme, it's true at lesser levels. When you think about clinical diagnoses of anxiety, PTSD, OCD, generalized anxiety, social anxiety, what is happening in these conditions is actually people are trying to seek certainty at a pathological level. So let's just take OCD as an example because you'll really see it. So there's a lot of variants of OCD. There's one variant called checking, right? So this is like, I'm checking to see if my stove is on. So I go, my body feels anxious, and in the energy of that anxiety, I behaviorally go and I check the stove. For a minute, I do get relief. But then the anxiety, and I go, oh my God, is the anxiety back? And I go and I check again. And then I feel a little bit, and then I go back and I check and I check and I check to try to get certainty. But here is the total curse of anxiety. The more I try to produce external forms of certainty by overworking or overchecking or overgiving or overfunctioning or overthinking, the worse I feel.
Yeah. The more anxiety you create.
Correct. If the strategy worked, my nervous system should be feeling better. But the more I do it, the worse I feel.
Interesting. Yeah.
So then the question is, and this kind of gets back to your trauma question as well. Okay, well, it sounds like if I don't like uncertainty, it sounds like the opposite of uncertainty should be certainty. But I'm actually saying the more you seek certainty, the more uncertain you will feel.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not my opinion. This is an evidence-based point. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So then what is the opposite of uncertainty?
Surrender.
Surrender. And I think another word for that, I think it's a beautiful word, is trust.
Trust. Yeah. Trust that things will be okay. Trust that this too shall pass. Trust that everything's happening and you'll find a way through. Trust in yourself, right? So surrendering to that trust. I love that. Yeah, that makes sense.
Exactly. And I think too, it's like so many of us, especially in a world that's so information driven, there's this idea that there should always be evidence. And so for a lot of us, the muscle, and I use that word very intentionally, the musculature of our nervous system's ability to activate the energy of trust is very weak. It's atrophied.
Right.
And so what happens is, and I would encourage people to look at, like, give me clear examples of where I don't trust myself.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I said I was going to wake up this morning and work out, and I didn't.
Hmm.
I said I wanted to show up on this podcast, but I got anxious and I didn't. So, what you start to see is you're giving yourself, it's not so much that trust itself is dangerous, it's that I'm giving myself plenty of examples where number one, I don't trust myself. I'm producing evidence of lack of self trust.
Right.
And then because of that, I'm not working out the muscle of trust. And again, I'm using this term muscle
Yeah.
very intentionally.
Right. As a practice. Right.
Yes.
Right. I love that. Yeah, I agree with that. In my last book, I mentioned Staring Down the Wolf. I talk about these commitments, and a commitment is a practice. It's like the difference between a value and a virtue, right? Virtue is a habituated value, then it becomes something you own. And courage, trust, and respect are the first three commitments for leaders. And courage, I put first because sometimes to get to trust, you have to step into courage. And that's the courage to look at your own, fill in the blank, right? That which is holding you back, that trigger, that trauma, that ism, right? Whatever form it takes courage to look at those things, especially for leaders who are putting themselves out there in whatever field, NGO, politics, business. The old school way was, hey, this leader is actually somewhat more evolved than the rest of us, or it has to be perfect, right? And you and I know that's never the case, right? There is no such thing as perfection in leadership or in anything in life. So leaders need to look, have the courage to look at their own
Themselves.
stuff, at themselves. Yeah. Take a hard look.
Well, I think too, I think about trust as as a scientist, I think people think that we're very evidence-based, and we are. But one of the things I think people miss is that no scientist in the world is able to hold anything in trust. They can't create evidence. They cannot create evidence until they first were able to trust. You got to roll the dice. You got to try to get that NIH grant. You get rejected a million times. In order to even hold things in evidence, there have to be leaders who are willing to roll the dice on trust. And I think the mechanism of that is courage.
Yes.
If I'm standing at the edge of a cliff, I've got to trust myself to jump off. But to get me off that cliff, I need courage.
Right. That's amazing. This is a great conversation. I wish we could go for another hour, but we can't. So
likewise. Hey, before you go, I have one question for you.
Of course.
What did you find to be the most surprising thing about your career with the Navy SEALs?
The amount of love that can be developed between individuals who face extraordinary risk together. I was not expecting that. And I love my teammates more than anything in the world, but it's a different type of love. Like Sanskrit has 67 ways to define love. It's a huge gap in our English language and our whole understanding of the world. So even in the most extraordinarily difficult circumstances in combat, like love and hate are like twins. They stand side by side.
What do you mean?
Well, when we're facing so much hate, you have to face it with an equal amount of love.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not something we would hear coming from many Navy SEALs, but that's the only way to survive and to thrive in those environments.
One of the things, I'll actually send you this article. I wrote a piece for Memorial Day that was published in the Chicago Trib. I wrote it about combat veterans and PTSD. I did a lot of couples therapy.
Yeah. My wife is a couples therapist, or she does both individual and couples.
But one of the things that I actually noticed was a theme. It wasn't in every single couple, but the wife would say, I know he's committed to me, but I feel like he loves the people he served with more. And a lot of times the guy would he would be quiet. So he wouldn't, say, oh, no, that's not true. And I think what I was hearing over and over again was the depth and the power of the connection.
That's right. Yeah. And I think that's kind of what I was talking about. People, since we don't have language around what that love is, then you feel a little bit almost embarrassed, or like it's at the expense of, let's say, the love for your family or for your spouse. And it's not. It's actually just a different type of love. And the more different ways that you can find to love, then the more that it spills over and it brings a richer relationship and a deeper connection to all other forms of love or individuals or groups that you love. It takes courage, right? It takes courage to open yourself up to that level of intimacy, especially for guys. It's very difficult for them to do, right? And this is like when it comes to veteran healing, one of the things that we do that's very effective is We put the men back together into a small team, and that team has a facilitator coach, right? And then we refer out to EMDR, refer out to psychedelic assisted therapy.
I was just going to ask you, do you guys use psychedelics?
Well, we refer out. We don't do that as an organization, but we certainly support it because we know how powerful it is, and I've experienced it myself. But that feeling of like, oh my God, I've got my team back, right? And they've got my back, and I can learn to trust again. It's profound. It's really helpful.
I want to ask you one other question. So this is something I think I sit with a lot, because obviously I deal with incredibly profound trauma. Mm-hmm. And when you say this idea of, there's always this trope, right? That like, and I'm not mocking it, that love is the most powerful energy or the most powerful force on the planet. Mm-hmm. But then you sort of look around at the world, and you don't even have to look at
see
the
a
world.
lot of absence of it.
We got to look in our own homes, the violence in our own homes, right? So when you think about, and I know this is an intimate question, so you don't have to answer it, but what do you think is more powerful, love or fear?
Love is always more powerful, and love can dispel fear, but fear can lock people into a limited consciousness that is, it's a pattern, and there's a lot of negative energy associated with fear. So the insertion of love into an environment, right? You see this like with transformative healing, right? So if there's no love, you're not going to find healing, but just one individual can bring in that love, that trust, that, that acceptance, and see that individual for what he really is. It's transformative. So I think love is obviously always far more powerful than fear, but it exists on a continuum. So fear is not the opposite of love. It's just the absence of love. We tend to think of everything dualistically, as if right, left, up, down, but it's just, when it comes to these energies, it's a continuum of more love, less love. And then you name the less love as anxiety, fear, anger, shame, right? And all the way up to courage. And then, above courage, you're going to have acceptance, forgiveness, love, universal love, compassion.
Well, these kind of questions drive me crazy. So I'm going to ask you, when we heal, there's like so many things that go into our healing. It's never just like a single thing. But if you had to name a single thing, what has healed you the most? Talk therapy, psychedelics, EMDR, I mean anything. It doesn't obviously have
it's interesting. That's a great question, because I think they heal different aspects of ourselves. Like, I'll tell you what, as a vet, ganglia block treatment was extraordinarily useful, because it reset my nervous system, and all of a sudden, I was just much calmer. And it wasn't any one thing, all things I was calmer toward. So that was like a phenomenal thing. EMDR, I've been doing EMDR for years. It's tapered down because released a lot of the energy, and so we're finding less application for it. But that really, without getting into the content, will simply release the nervous system's energy. And so it's very useful for anyone who's experienced trauma, but it's painful to remember the trauma, or they can't remember the trauma. EMDR still works. So I love that for veterans. It's very, very useful. And then psychedelics is really valuable for recontextualizing one's entire life, to suddenly experience a non-dual state, or the magic of that unity experience, and the beauty for vets who are in the state of desperation, or they've lost their will, they've really lost their understanding, they're kind of in a nihilistic state. It can be transformative. I've had vets say that one single experience completely transformed them.
I know. It's like MDMA is about to be approved for PTSD, and you look at some of the like single session,
one session.
What psychedelic was the most powerful for you? And again, I know each has its own.
I would say 5-LEO-DMT, because first of all, like for me, I've done some ayahuasca. I don't love the discomfort associated with it. So I tend to try to control the experience with intense breathing and, whatnot. And so I have difficulty surrendering. With 5-LEO-DMT, the desert toad, you can't not surrender, right? There is no you to surrender. You're just gone. It just collapses the ego, and you have this extraordinary, like 15-minute experience of non-duality. And when you come back from that, like everything's different. You just see the world very differently, and see relationships. So to me, that's the most profound. I did some ibogaine with vets down in a group called the Mission Within down in Mexico. These individuals are on the leading edge of veteran healing with iboga. This is like tough cases, right? An iboga plant. It's considered the grandfather to ayahuasca. And it's a very long, somewhat painful experience for most, but it's transformative, like 80% success rate, and even healing addictions to include heroin addiction, which is extraordinary, right? So veterans are getting helped a lot with that. That didn't, again, I think because of where I'm at, Julia, I've been meditating since I was 21 years old. And so now psychedelics don't affect my brain
Yeah.
the way that, the first couple experiences, yeah. Then after that, I experienced them really just as a nice meditation. But for those who first time or even, dealing with unresolved trauma, man, they can be really powerful. But I think some preparation is advised, right? So I would say ganglia block. If you're in a state of hyperarousal, ganglia block definitely. Then a period of EMDR, begin to release some of the nervous system energy, begin to recontextualize things, and kind of do that preparatory work for the psychedelics, and you'll have a much more pleasant experience, because psychedelics can really kick you in the jimmy. And I know a lot of people who don't, they have really
Yeah.
rough experiences with it.
Do you still carry a lot of the energy of your childhood trauma with you, or do you feel a lot has been forgiven?
Well, I hesitate to say it's all been forgiven. I would like to think that forgiveness is a big part of my practice every day. I tended to, you've probably heard of the Hoffman process. I've
Mhm.
spoken about it quite openly here, and I know others have. But that was extremely helpful for me to understand my parents better, and how and why they were the way they were, and then the profound forgiveness practice, forgiveness, and then actually enduring practice that came from that was very helpful. Ultimately, I think like the worst of our traumas, happen in the first 7 years of our lives, because
Oh, yeah.
that's when,
Well, you wanna hear something crazy about the brain? The brain doesn't even start, reliably making autobiographical memories until age 7.
oh,
So
I
if there
was
was
thinking
a
3 or
more
4. You're 7, huh?
No, autobiographical memories reliably start to come online really, and, some people will be like, "I remember the first day of kindergarten," but overwhelmingly, like,
Yeah.
the entities in the brain that are needed for that type of autobiographical memory come online around 7. So I think it's like there's like God is playing a trick on all of us, right? So it's like if there's a stronger argument for our stunning interdependence, the majority of my identity, my core memories are constructed at a time that I can't even consciously remember.
You can't
Why
consciously
can't
say that you were Julia or Mark, right?
Yeah,
100%.
yeah.
And everything, this is so classic because, it speaks to also, spiritual teachings, is that, this identity that we claim as ours is a fabrication. It's a construct, right? It's stories that we tell ourselves. And that, like you said, if you have a core programming element in that story that is negative or coming from a lack, a trauma, like you said, I am not worthy, or why did nobody listens to me, or I'm not, insert blank, then that colors the entire identity going forward until it's addressed.
I know we're just like kind of just
That's fine.
jamming right now, but the third code in Energy Rising is all about the energy of humiliation. It's the only code I picked one emotion to talk about. I actually think, this is so one of the things that came through in my work with combat veterans is, in case it isn't self evident, I'm a civilian. And so when I started to have these guys come to me for PTSD, I was like, yeah, I'm pretty sure I kind of know what the worst thing is, that you were going to die. And what I was hearing across guys, across combats, across continents was they were like, yeah, I didn't necessarily want to die. But the worst thing was being the guy on the mission who didn't have his shit together, was being the guy on the mission that other people couldn't depend on, was being the guy on the mission who now has this moral injury that no matter what I do, like, so what I was hearing over and over and over in truly this life or death context was a fate worse than death, was this energy of humiliation.
Hmm. That's fascinating. Yeah, the shame associated with not living up to your, or not being there for your teammate, right? Or not being able to perform, or even, not being the one who died.
Exactly.
Survivor's guilt.
Exactly.
Fascinating. Hey everyone, this is Mark Devine, founder of SEALFIT and Unbeatable Mind, and I'm super stoked to announce that my new book, Uncommon, is due out from St. Martin's Press this summer, July 16th. And we've launched a pre-order campaign. You can learn more about that at readuncommon.com.
to try to get early awareness for the book, which I hope will help a lot of people, where I go and do a deep dive on the 5 mountains of personal mastery: physical, mental, emotional, intuitional, and spiritual. Uncommon, simple principles for an extraordinary life. Check it out at readuncommon.com. And thank you for your support and being part of the change that you want to see in this world. Hoo-yah. Divine out.
Energy Rising, the Neuroscience of Leading with Emotional Power, Harvard Business Review Press. That's fantastic. Is it published? It's out in the marketplace right now?
It is. Yep. It just came out. So I encourage people, if they're interested in the brain and this idea of emotional power and how to really transform our pain into power, check it out.
No doubt. And if someone wants to reach out to you, they're interested in, the work you do, what's a good place to find you?
You can find me, like most people these days, I'm on all the social media handles. So I'm at Dr. Julia DiGangi on LinkedIn, Dr. Julia DiGangi on Instagram. And then on Facebook, I'm just Julia DiGangi. And I also have a newsletter, Substack, Dr. Julia DiGangi.
Well, thank you so much, Julia. I really, appreciate the work you're doing. And I think your book is going to help a lot of people. And I super enjoyed this conversation. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Oh, thanks for talking to me.
You should start a podcast.
The journalist and the psychologist in me,
I know, right? You need the Energy Rising podcast. You would be an excellent interviewer and host.
Oh, well, thank you.
I know, but
you were a great interviewer.
Time. Got to be judicious with it, right? All right. So once again, Julia, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, if there's any way I can ever help you in your work, I think what you're doing is incredible. I would definitely love to connect again.
Thank you so much.
Likewise.